Welcome to Geoeconomics Insight Special Edition with Dr. Bastian Gigerich.
That's very good.
Yeah.
I'll take that. Yeah.
Okay. Dr. Bastian Gigerich, the Director General and Chief Executive of the International Institute of Strategic Studies, or IISS. The IISS and the International House of Japan has concluded a strategic relationship, and the Institute of Geoeconomics, as a part of the International House of Japan, has also has a close connection with the IISS. We are sending the young scholars to work in the IISS headquarters in London, and we have a new scholarship program to send the young scholar to IISS Asia in Singapore. So we do have this strategic exchange program, and we are very happy with that. We are also working on the translation of the Adelphi paper, which is published by the IISS, and one of Adelphi books, which is written by the Dr. Robert Ward, the director of the Japan Chair Program, and also Ms. Yuka Kushino, who was also the scholarship member of our program, who studied in IISS and later hired by the IISS. And this book, which is Japan's Effectiveness as a Geoeconomic Actor, which will be published soon in Japanese. So I'm delighted to have Bastian as a guest of this episode, and Bastian is currently the Director General of IISS, but he previously worked in the German Ministry of Defense and also being responsible for the IISS flagship program called the Military Balance. So what I would like to do today is that to discuss with Bastian on the current state of the international order. The international order is currently very fragile and very dangerous. What happened in the Middle East and Ukraine, Russia, and also what happened in East Asia all comes to a sort of a sense that the traditional understanding of international order is changing. And although not entirely changing, but there are certain elements that is becoming more unpredictable and unforeseeable. So I think this is an interesting discussion for you to discuss with you about the current state of international order in the various areas, but focusing on the Middle East, Russia, Ukraine, and East Asia. So let's start with the ongoing situation in the Middle East. What happened in Lebanon, the attack on the Hezbollah, was so-called the supply chain attack, which is using the means of placing the explosives in the process of production or the logistics. And there are explosion of the devices like pagers and the walkie-talkie, and this has been a scary moment that every appliances or devices is being used as a weapon. So do you think that this sort of a supply chain attacks and using these ordinary devices as a weapon would change the dynamics of warfare, or is this going to be changing the sort of a trend of technology, like Internet of Things, putting everything connected to internet, like automated cars or any house appliances? Do you think that these remotely controlled or remotely accessed devices would be a danger, so that the technology would change?
Well, Katsuto, thank you very much for having me. First of all, it's a real delight to be here, and of course, I'd like to also start by thanking International House for the strong partnership that we have. I'm really proud that we have this partnership, and I'm looking forward to working together in that framework. Now, on your on your question on that supply chain attack, I think it's important to separate two things. One is to look at it in the context of the conflict itself, where a lot of people felt that it initially was from the Israeli point of view, tactical success, but with unclear strategic implications. And I think now people are perhaps understanding that it was really one step in a sequence of steps that we see unfolding now. So I would say judging that moment for its military implications, we'll have to see how the rest of that unfolds. But I think you're pointing to a bigger issue,
right.
and the bigger issue is, and perhaps a strategic issue in its own right, is that this attack, these events, certainly underline the vulnerability or the issue of supply chain vulnerability. And I think by itself, that is actually not a new issue, but I think this event will propel this to the forefront of people's minds. And really to say, unless you understand every step in your supply chain through the different layers, you can't really make a judgment on security of the resilience of your supply chain. Now, but you also asked, will this change behavior? And I'm not sure it will actually, because it seems to me that the interpretation of what we've seen was that these were specific devices purchased by a specific group and distributed to members of that group, and they were targeted in that sense, actually, with precision. So I don't think people will immediately jump to the conclusion that devices are not secure, and therefore I don't think it will change the long-term technology trend that you've mentioned.
Right. Oh, thank you very much. I think that's a very clear answer. But at the same time, for example, if we look back 20 some years ago, the September 11 attack was the very extraordinary attack, because using the airplane as a weapon, and which eventually leads to much tighter, the security control. And probably, I think you're right that to monitor the supply chain and how how procurement procedures are being safeguarded is going to be one of the issue. And what is interesting is that when we talk about the economic security, we also talk about the supply chain. This is more about the resilience and the dependence. But I think in the supply chain comes to a sort of a double-fold problem, because on the one hand you need to concern about the supply chain, where you purchase from, and also you have to think of the supply chain processes, whether these are secured or not. So I think one way or another, the concept of supply chain or the process of supply chain is becoming as a sort of a central issue of the security today. Following the question on the Middle East, I think the current action by the Israeli government is initiated by the October 7th, 2023 Hamas attack on Israel. So it was a terrorist attack, and it was Israel has the right of self-defense, but it seems that it is go beyond the proportionality, and I think the way in which that Israel has responded in a sort of an excessive way, and there are a lot of criticism over the Israeli actions. Do you think that these retaliation can be justified, and to what extent the Israel is aiming to gain from these actions? I think if we look at the stated objective, returning of the hostages, securing the security of Israel, and destroying Hamas, none of them are achieve. It seems that it's not achieving to the goal of the stated aim, and also the current, action in the north against Hezbollah the stated aim is to return those evacuated, population from the north will be back by, containing Hezbollah attack. But I think it's not successfully achieving by those means. So, do you think that whether it's a legally acceptable response in terms of the proportionality, and whether it's the appropriate means to achieve its goals?
Well, look, let me start with a few points because that's a very complicated question. So I think the first one is, as you said, it's worth emphasizing that Israel is, of course, situated in a neighborhood where there are several actors whose official policy it is to destroy Israel. And Israel has been attacked by terrorists, so there's no doubt about Israel's right to defend itself in those circumstances. So I think we should make that clear. And of course, as you suggested, we now have the situation where in northern Israel there's a depopulated strip of land effectively, and in southern Lebanon you effectively have the same. So you have this this phenomenon occurring without the results being achieved. Now, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm going to be a little bit careful on this issue of international humanitarian law and proportionality that you mentioned. But I do think it's worth pointing out that the proportionality rule is meant to be a constraint preventing excessive civilian death and damage and collateral damage, but in relation to the anticipated military advantage that might result from any military action. So it's important to understand that this is relational. So you can't quantify and say, well, how much is too much. That's actually not what the principle is based on. So that's one complication, and therefore really one would need to understand the robustness and the way the Israeli targeting process works. And I think Israel could explain perhaps a bit more about what it does to prevent excessive civilian damage and death. And I think that is probably the way to assess this. But I don't think one cannot go in terms of numbers and say this is too much. That's just not how that principle works. I do think, though, if we look at, we should probably also mention that Israelis, the military actions of the government of Israel are quite controversial within Israel itself, and actually a significant part of the population probably would have contrasting views. But I do think that the government of Israel at this point seems to at least accept the possibility of several steps of escalation in that conflict, including a further international dimension to that conflict. And I think that is in part driven because Israel does feel it has superiority in intelligence terms, in military capability terms, and probably also in terms resulting from the backing of the United States and several other international partners.
Right. Yes, we have to look at the not by numbers, but I think it has to be placed in a context.
That's right.
Otherwise, it's very difficult to understand what's going on. But nevertheless, I think the war is still going on, and it's stretching to the south and north. So probably the international dimension, which includes possibility of engaging with Iran, could be a certain further extension, and how United States will respond to that will be another issue. But it remains to be seen. So let's turn our eyes to Europe, the Russian invasion in Ukraine. although you said you are not lawyer, but it is a clear violation of the international law. It is invading a sovereign state, and those actions are just simply violating all the basis that is built up after the World War II to make sure that these. And Russia is a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, which is responsible and should be responsible for the international peace and security, but that Russia is turning against the idea.
Yeah.
So do you think that this is somehow distorting or destroying the existing international order, or how this... I'm not going to discuss about the details of the war, but how do you see in the bigger picture that this action will change the concept of the international order, which should be, which principle that we should be based on?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think actually a lot of it will depend on the outcome of the war, because I think what we all can agree on, or most people will be able to agree on, is that Russia is engaged in an illegal war of aggression and actually aims basically to eradicate another sovereign country. Right. So I think that is, as you suggested, that is a fundamental challenge to the international system, the UN system, international law, and so on. And if Russia is allowed to succeed, I think the damage will be severe to those rules, norms, and the institutions that support and meant to maintain, and to the degree that that's possible, even defend those rules. Now, so therefore, I think the response is really important. From my point of view, the response of all of those who are interested in maintaining international rules and maintaining institutions that can look after those rules, the response would be to make sure that Ukraine wins and Russia loses. Because if Ukraine wins with the help of other actors in the international system, there is actually an argument that even though the rules were broken, international activity was started to defend them. So I think a lot depends on whether those who support Ukraine internationally enable Ukraine to win. If Ukraine loses, Russia is allowed to win. I think that's how one has to frame it. Then I think the damage to the international system and the remnants, and we might want to come back to this, but the remnants of the international rules-based order will be severely damaged, in my view.
Right. But at the same time, I think we'll come back this later, but the US election in November might have changed the course of the current international effort to support Ukraine and to push back this sort of illegal aggression and to restore the international order. So that will be a very concerning part of the future of the international order. So related to the warfare in Ukraine, I think what is interesting is that the newly appointed EU Commissioner for Defense, Mr. Kubilius, warned that EU member states that there will be a serious confrontation with Russia in 6 to 8 years. Do you think that there will be a possibility that Russia, if it has been, if Russia wins, and then it still has the ambition to confront with European NATO states, or do you think that these possibility of the Russian aggression may change the course, like a Zeitenwende in Germany, to enter into much more further turn around the course of the history and to become more sort of how do I say, less dormant player, or do you think that this would change the concept of the deterrence? Currently the Russians are not engaging in any way with the NATO states, but do you think that the deterrence may have a different effect in the future?
From the point of view of the conflict itself, if Russia wins or if there is a ceasefire and a settlement that is imposed on Ukraine, I think that will lead to further conflict and further instability. And one of the challenges with Russian aggression, as it is presented by Vladimir Putin's regime and supported by enough Russians, it seems, that he can keep going, is that it is a concept of imperial conquest. And there's no natural, logical point where that would end. And I think, therefore, a lot of governments and people in Central and Eastern Europe feel that if Russia succeeds, it is likely to keep going. So that's the worry. The new commissioner, he still has to have his confirmation hearings, but he's been designated, has pointed to some of these factors. And I think for Europe, the problem is because Europe has underinvested in its defense capability for some 25 years, and it has allowed its armed forces to be hollowed out in terms of structures, in terms of equipment, in terms of stockpiling, ammunition, spare parts, all of these kinds of things. It now is facing a window of vulnerability, because it will take time to fix this. And there are different views of what the timelines are, but the worry is that Russia could have the ability to, even though it has lost a lot of its land forces at least, and a lot of equipment, a lot of the other elements of Russian military capability are actually still largely intact, so that it could recapitalize and therefore represent a threat to NATO allies. And so NATO allies now, at the moment, are not ready in terms of their equipment, their manpower, and their ammunition holdings to succeed. But they're working on this. And defense spending has increased a lot. There are new investment programs. That's, of course, it's not all about money, but it's part of the equation. So there's a window of vulnerability that will last, I would say, to the end of this decade, actually, before this really has been turned around. And of course, in the meantime, while you're right that Russia seems to still feel deterred by NATO in terms of direct military confrontation, there's a lot already happening below the threshold of military confrontation in terms of disinformation campaigns, attacks on critical infrastructure, even attacks on individuals that do point to a certain degree of conflict already in the relationship between Russia and NATO member states, even though it might not have crossed a certain threshold. But it's already there, and it's already felt by a number of nations in Europe.
Right. So it seems that there are a lot of lessons to be learned in Japan. That although we are not in the same situation, but I think there are sort of an expansionist tendency of China in territorially to the South China Sea, East China Sea, and probably the Taiwan Strait. And this sort of an expansion will meet at a certain point, and with the vulnerability that we have. And of course, both Europe and Japan are the treaty ally of the United States, but it seems that it is not always the although the alliance with the United States will have a very strong weight on the deterrence, but at the same time, there are a lot of things that we need to be done by ourselves to make sure that we are closing the window of vulnerability. But talking about the United States, the U.S. election in November will put the alliance in danger in a way that if Mr. Trump will be elected, and his previous administration has took a distance from the European countries, and there are certain fear that the U.S. commitment in alliance will be much lower, and on top of that, Mr. Trump is publicly saying that he's going to end the war between Russia and Ukraine. It seems that his idea is just freeze as it is. So it seems that it's not Russia win, but it's not the Ukraine regaining its sovereignty on the certain occupied territories. So how do you see? I mean, I'm not asking you to predict the outcome of the election, but what if Mr. Trump has elected, and there is a possibility that that the U.S. commitment to alliance is going to be lower than it ever been. Do you think that it has what sort of responses we need to take as an allies, and what will be the consequences of the forces of the concept on the concept of deterrence?
Well, look, I think all of us who are U.S. allies should recognize that the burden on the U.S. is quite high. The U.S. needs to maintain a security presence and live up to treaty-based commitments in case of Europe, in case of Japan, and elsewhere. And that's very hard, even with the resources of the United States, to do this in multiple regions around the world, where we have challenges in all regions. Europe at war, a conflict with potential to escalate in the Middle East, and certainly tensions in the Pacific. So that's very hard, and I think so. It would be smart for allies to realize that they should certainly invest in their own defense capabilities, but also in their diplomatic efforts and in their economic resilience, economic security posture, to make the argument to the U.S. that they are credible and important partners themselves, that generate value added to the relationship. I think that's important for all of us, and frankly, that's important independent of who wins on 5th of November. I think that's smart in any case. But the commitment is an interesting question. The first Trump administration, I think, had everybody worried, where it looked like alliance commitments might be interpreted a bit in a very transactional way. You pay more, or I won't protect you. A bit like a schoolyard bully. So that's obviously not reassuring. The interesting thing is that should Trump be reelected, he might interpret what has happened in his first term as that threats to allies can succeed, because he might look at Europe and say, oh, look at this. Now, a clear and notable majority of NATO member states does spend 2% of GDP on defense. So it worked, and he might learn that, therefore, then I will do it again. And that's a real concern. It's not a prediction, but it is a concern. So that makes it important for allies to think this through. And you asked about deterrence and the impact there. I think in conventional military terms, I think NATO allies, for example, in Europe, could do a lot to compensate for a less engaged US in their own regional security context. I assume the same actually applies for several US partners in the Indo-Pacific and elsewhere. The nuclear question is, of course, an interesting one because we know that the deterrence posture involves a nuclear element. And in Europe, it has already led to a conversation about, well, what should Europe's nuclear posture be? Europe has, of course, NATO Europe has, of course, two nuclear powers with the United Kingdom and France. But really, there's a strong sense that the ultimate credibility of deterrence depends on the United States in this area. And if the United States wasn't there, I think it would lead to a conversation in Europe about whether it needs to strengthen its own capabilities in that area. And I could imagine something similar might happen in the Pacific, where other countries might also wonder whether they need to have a conversation, whatever that might lead to. But I think that you can see the early signs of that in Europe already.
Right. Nicely turned into the question of the Indo-Pacific and East Asia. I think the situation in East Asia is also very complicated because not only the two nuclear powers, Russia and China, but also there is nuclear capability in North Korea, which is now starting to state, abandon the idea of reunification and then, starting to regard South Korea as an enemy state. And also there are a lot of activities. I mean, yesterday there was an invasion, airspace invasion by Russian forces. There is a joint operation, exercise with, a patrolling exercise with China and Russia. So there is a lot of activities going on. What happened in the South China Sea, the second Thomas Shore, and there is a various still, Coast Guard to Coast Guard conflict, but there is a territorial dispute between the Philippines and China is taking place. There's a lot of things going on, and of course Japan has been as a part of the Indo-Pacific has engaged in changing its security posture by setting up a national security strategy and increasing defense budget. And I think with regard to the situation in Asia, what do you see the possibility of this coalition or the alignment of the position between NATO countries and so-called AP4 or IP4, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. AP4 stands for Asia Pacific, 4 countries. IP is Indo-Pacific, 4 countries. So these 4 countries are now constantly participating in the summit of the NATO summit and also strengthening the relationship. So do you think that these alliance between the Europe and East Asian countries would have, or Indo-Pacific countries would have a certain effect on the changing the dynamics in the Pacific? What happened mostly in East Asia, South China Sea, all these situations?
Well, look, I would say that the first thing to take from this closer relationship is to understand that the security dynamics are in both regions are connected in the Pacific and in Europe. And in part they are connected because on the opposing side you have China that is working with Russia, Russia that is working with Iran, DPRK is working with Russia, working with China. So these things are connected and they work in both directions. And I think that's important to understand. There was a lot of talk over the last couple of years about Europeans taking a new interest in the Pacific security questions. But I think the opposite is also true. And people are beginning to understand the links a bit better. And of course, including in the opposite direction, some defense companies from Indo-Pacific nations actually being quite successful in Europe. So that dynamic exists. And I think in that process, the European view of China has changed a bit, as much more considered to be a rival and a more aggressive and assertive actor than people had perhaps realized. Now, you mentioned recent activities in the South China Sea and in Coast Guard terms and all these things. And I think what they show is that China seems to believe at this point that, or perhaps China engages in these things for three main reasons. A, because they can, because their capability has evolved significantly over the last couple of years. Second, because they're learning from it. One thing that China lacks is operational experience, whether you like it or not, but this provides operational experience. And the third point is that it works for China. So I don't think Europeans will change that, but they are, I don't think they have the means to really change that. But I do think it is significant if, for example, as we had recently, a German naval presence in the region, exercising freedom of navigation operations, which Germany hasn't done for more than 20 years. I think that in the Taiwan Straits, I think that is significant, and that does show an increased worry. I don't think it will change how China behaves, but I do think it suggests a greater understanding that actually our security dynamics are related. Now, there are always a few countries in NATO that will be quick to say NATO doesn't really have a big role to play in the Pacific. It doesn't have the NATO nations, other than the US, don't really have the capabilities to do much. I think that's true, but that doesn't mean one shouldn't take this very seriously. And in part, I think because there is worry that China's and Russia's collaboration is perhaps on a trajectory that should worry both Europeans and those Asia-Pacific nations, Indo-Pacific nations that you've mentioned.
Well, I think this is a very interesting discussion. I think there's a lot of things going on, but often, we are taking too much sort of an excessive reaction to what happened in outside, but we need to understand more precisely and with a careful consideration of the intent and the strategy and also the possible means to face those challenges. And I think the last point that you mentioned about the stronger relationship between the AP4 countries and NATO creates not physical presence of NATO or the providing physical capabilities, but still I think this will show that the international order is shaped by these determinations, the coalition of the countries which shares the same values and the principles, and to demonstrate that what other countries like Russia or China is doing is not according to the principles of international order. And I think at the end of the day, we need to restore the certain stability, but based on the rules, which were currently neglected or overlooked by the bigger states like Russia, or even in the case of United States for the trade issues. And I think these are I think this is the time that we need to start seriously thinking about how to restore the international order based on the rules and to try to avoid the world is, world order is based on power.
Look at the Shangri-La dialogue this year in 2024, which the IISS organizes in Singapore. There was quite a bit of talk about that we have actually moved from a rules-based order to a rules-broken order, right. and part of this reality is that if rules are not defended and if they're not modernized, they're likely to wither away, and then especially in a situation where you have countries that are explicitly setting out to challenge the status quo, right. Not defend the status quo, challenge the status quo. And I think that is the world that we live in. And at the same time, Japan, many European nations, of course, have to find a way to prosper, to trade, to be open, or have open societies, while investing in supply chain resilience and in what we call economic security these days, where Japan actually has been one of the leading nations in developing that concept. So I think that is part of the reality of why this is also challenging, right. With these conflicts going on, while the fundamentals of the system that we're used to and in which we have prospered are being challenged.
Right. So, Bastian, it was wonderful to discuss.
Thank you very much.
And I think this was a very wonderful beginning of your directorship. And
thank you.
And IISS, and we are very happy to continue our relationship.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
AI の軍事的な利用が既成事実化していく中で、じゃあそれを具体的にどこまで規制するのかというところに論点が移ってきているというか拡張してきているような状況だと